The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Martinez walked toward the physical training field. Her steps were measured, careful, though she tried to hide the slight limp that had become her constant companion. At 28, she had already seen more combat than most soldiers twice her age, but today felt different. Today she would face something that made her more nervous than any battlefield. The other soldiers were already gathered, stretching and preparing for the monthly fitness assessment. Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she approached, some curious, others skeptical. She had been assigned to this new unit just 3 weeks ago, and whispers had already begun circulating about the damaged goods transfer, who couldn't keep up with the demands of active duty. Colonel James Patterson stood at the center of the group, his imposing figure commanding immediate attention. He was old-school military, the kind of officer who believed that excellence came only through pushing past every limit. His reputation preceded him. He had never shown mercy to anyone he deemed weak, and he took pride in maintaining the highest standards in his unit. "All right, listen up," Patterson's voice boomed across the field. "Today's assessment will determine who stays and who gets reassigned to desk duty. I don't care about your excuses, your complaints, or your sob stories. Results are all that matter here." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had prepared for this moment for weeks, knowing that her new commanding officer would put her to the test. The pain medication she took each morning helped manage the constant ache in her left side, but it couldn't completely mask what the enemy's improvised explosive device had done to her body 8 months ago in Afghanistan. The first exercise was push-ups. Sarah lowered herself to the ground, feeling the familiar pull of scar tissue beneath her uniform. She had practiced this routine countless times in physical therapy, learning to work around the limitations that the shrapnel had left behind. As she began the exercise, she could feel Colonel Patterson's gaze fixed on her. "Come on, Martinez," he called out after she completed her 15th repetition. "My grandmother could do better than that." "What's your excuse this time?" The other soldiers continued their exercises, but Sarah could sense their attention shifting toward the confrontation brewing between her and the colonel. She pushed through 5 more repetitions before her left arm began to shake uncontrollably. The damage to her shoulder muscles made it impossible to maintain proper form, and she knew that continuing would only risk further injury. "Sir, I have a medical limitation that prevents me from—" Sarah began, but Patterson cut her off with a dismissive wave. "Medical limitation?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "Let me guess, another soldier looking for an easy way out. I've seen your type before, Martinez. You get a little scratch in combat and suddenly think you deserve special treatment." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent months in rehabilitation, enduring surgeries and painful therapy sessions, fighting to return to active duty when doctors suggested she take a medical discharge. The little scratch Patterson referred to had nearly killed her, and the road to recovery had been the hardest battle of her life. "Sir, with respect, it's not—" Sarah tried again, but the colonel's expression grew even more stern. "Save it for someone who cares, Captain. Either you complete this assessment like every other soldier in my unit, or you can pack your bags and find yourself a nice, comfortable position behind a desk somewhere. I won't have dead weight dragging down my team." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze upon her, some sympathetic, others judging. She had faced enemy fire, survived an explosion that should have killed her, and fought her way back to active duty against all odds. But standing there in front of her new unit, she felt more vulnerable than she had in any combat zone. Her mind raced back to that day in Afghanistan when everything changed. She had been leading a patrol through a village when the IED detonated just meters away from her position. The blast had thrown her against a concrete wall, and she remembered the feeling of warm blood running down her side as her team rushed to evacuate her. The field medics had worked frantically to stabilize her, shouting medical terms she didn't understand while she drifted in and out of consciousness. The weeks that followed were a blur of hospital rooms, surgical procedures, and the gradual realization of how close she had come to never returning home. The shrapnel had torn through her left side, damaging muscles, nerves, and leaving scars that would never fully fade. But worse than the physical damage was the doubt that crept in during those long nights in the hospital. Doubt about whether she would ever be the soldier she once was. "Well?" Patterson's voice brought her back to the present moment. "Are you going to stand there all day making excuses, or are you going to show me what you're made of?" Sarah looked around at her fellow soldiers, seeing a mixture of expressions on their faces. Some looked uncomfortable with the colonel's harsh treatment, while others seemed to agree with his assessment. She realized that this moment would define not just her relationship with Patterson, but her standing within the entire unit. Taking a deep breath, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had spent months hiding her scars, covering them with careful clothing choices and deflecting questions about her medical history. The Army had taught her to be strong, to never show weakness, to push through pain and discomfort. But standing there under Patterson's judgmental gaze, she realized that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was reveal their truth. Her hands moved slowly to the zipper of her military jacket, and she could see confusion flicker across Patterson's face. The other soldiers stopped their exercises, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Sarah had never shown anyone outside of her medical team the full extent of what the explosion had done to her body, but she knew that words alone would never convince Patterson of what she had endured. The morning air felt cool against her skin as she prepared to reveal the evidence of her sacrifice, the proof of her courage, and the reason why her limitations were not weakness but the price of her service to her country. As Sarah slowly unzipped her jacket, the morning air seemed to grow quieter around the training field. The usual sounds of military life, distant vehicle engines, radio chatter, and the rhythmic cadence of marching feet faded into background noise as every person present focused on the unfolding scene before them. Colonel Patterson's expression shifted from smug confidence to puzzled irritation. He had used this same aggressive approach countless times throughout his career, and it had always produced the desired result. Soldiers either rose to meet his challenge or revealed themselves as unsuitable for his unit. He expected Martinez to either break down under pressure or storm off in anger, giving him the justification he needed to recommend her transfer. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Captain?" Patterson demanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to having his methods questioned. "This is a military exercise, not a strip show. Get your jacket back on and either complete the assessment or remove yourself from my field." But Sarah continued her deliberate movements, her fingers working steadily down the zipper. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, not from fear of combat or enemy fire, but from the vulnerability of what she was about to reveal. These scars were her most private reminder of the day that changed everything, and she had never willingly shown them to anyone who didn't need to see them for medical reasons. The other soldiers began to gather closer, their own exercises forgotten, as they sensed the tension building between their new team member and their commanding officer. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran of 2 tours in Iraq, moved slightly forward, his instincts telling him that something important was happening. Private Johnson, barely out of basic training, watched with wide eyes, unsure of what protocol demanded in such an unusual situation. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "You said you wanted to see what I'm made of. You called my limitations excuses and questioned my commitment to serving. I think you need to understand exactly what those limitations are and how I earned them." Patterson's jaw tightened. In his 25 years of military service, he had rarely encountered such direct defiance of his authority. Most soldiers either cowered under his harsh assessment or left the service entirely. This captain was doing something entirely different, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite define. As Sarah pulled her jacket open and then carefully removed it entirely, the white tank top underneath revealed what she had been hiding. The left side of her torso was a map of surgical scars and healed shrapnel wounds, some thin and precise from medical procedures, others irregular and jagged from the metal fragments that had torn through her body. The scarring extended from just below her collarbone down to her waist, a testament to the severity of the injuries she had sustained. The reaction was immediate and profound. Several soldiers audibly gasped while others stood in stunned silence. Sergeant Rodriguez unconsciously took a step backward, his own combat experience helping him understand immediately what he was looking at. "Private." Johnson's face went pale as he realized he was seeing the physical evidence of the kind of sacrifice he had only read about in training manuals. Colonel Patterson's expression underwent a dramatic transformation. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shock and perhaps even embarrassment. He had seen combat injuries before, of course, but he had expected to find weakness in Martinez, not evidence of extraordinary survival and dedication. "These scars," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she committed fully to her revelation. Represent 8 pieces of shrapnel that the field surgeons couldn't remove without risking permanent paralysis. Every day I feel them when I move, when I breathe, when I sleep. The largest piece is lodged less than an inch from my spine, and the doctors told me that one wrong movement could end my military career permanently. She turned slightly, allowing the assembled group to see the full extent of the scarring on her back. Where the explosion had thrown her against the concrete wall, the impact had left its own pattern of marks, and the surgical scars from multiple operations created a complex web across her skin. The day I got these, Sarah continued, I was leading a patrol through a village outside of Kandahar. Intelligence had reported possible insurgent activity, but the area had been quiet for weeks. We were conducting a routine sweep when the IED detonated. The blast killed 2 of my soldiers instantly and wounded 3 others. I stayed conscious long enough to coordinate the evacuation of my wounded men before the medics finally forced me onto a stretcher. The training field had become completely silent except for Sarah's voice. Even Patterson seemed frozen, unable to interrupt or respond to what he was hearing and seeing. The other soldiers looked at their new team member with a mixture of awe and respect that hadn't been there minutes before. I spent 4 months in military hospitals, Sarah went on, carefully putting her jacket back on, but leaving it unzipped so the scars remained visible. The doctors performed 6 separate surgeries to remove as much shrapnel as they could safely extract. They told me I would never return to active duty, that the damage was too extensive, that I should consider myself lucky to be alive. She paused, looking directly at Colonel Patterson with eyes that held no anger, only determination and pride. But I didn't want to be lucky to be alive, sir. I wanted to be worthy of the sacrifice my soldiers made that day. So I spent the next 4 months in rehabilitation, learning to work around these limitations, pushing my body to function despite the permanent damage. Sergeant Rodriguez cleared his throat softly, and when Sarah looked in his direction, she saw something in his expression that she recognized immediately, the look of one combat veteran acknowledging another. He had seen enough wounded warriors to understand the magnitude of what she had accomplished just by standing there in uniform. Every exercise I do, Sarah continued, every mission I complete, every day I serve, I do it carrying these reminders of what we sacrifice for our country and our fellow soldiers. When I struggle with a push-up or can't lift as much weight as I used to, it's not because I'm weak or looking for an easy way out. It's because I left part of myself on a battlefield in Afghanistan, and I'm still finding ways to serve with what remains. The morning sun had climbed higher during her revelation, casting different shadows across the field and highlighting the determination in Sarah's face. Colonel Patterson stood motionless, clearly struggling with how to respond to a situation that had evolved far beyond his standard operating procedures. The silence stretched across the training field like a heavy blanket, broken only by the distant sound of morning reveille playing from the base's loudspeakers. Colonel Patterson stood frozen, his usual commanding presence diminished as he struggled to process what he had just witnessed. For the first time in his long military career, his harsh assessment methods had backfired spectacularly, revealing not weakness but extraordinary strength and sacrifice. Sarah remained standing with her jacket open, the morning breeze causing her tank top to flutter slightly against her scarred skin. She watched Patterson's face carefully, seeing the internal struggle playing out in his expressions. The man who had built his reputation on breaking down soldiers to rebuild them stronger was clearly grappling with the realization that he had just attempted to break someone who had already been broken and rebuilt. Herself. Captain Martinez, Patterson finally managed, his voice lacking its earlier authority. He cleared his throat and tried again, but the words seemed to stick. In 25 years of military service, he had encountered many wounded warriors, but most of them had either taken medical retirement or accepted limited duty assignments. Standing before him was a soldier who had fought through devastating injuries to return to full active duty, only to face his ignorant mockery. Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his weathered face showing deep respect as he addressed Sarah directly. "Ma'am, I served 3 tours in Iraq and saw plenty of soldiers come back from IED attacks. Most of them never made it back to active duty, and those who did usually couldn't handle field assignments. The fact that you're here in uniform ready to serve, that's something special." Private Johnson, still pale but clearly moved by what he had witnessed, nodded enthusiastically. I can't believe you went through all that and still wanted to come back. In basic training, they told us stories about heroes, but I never thought I'd actually serve with one. Sarah felt an unexpected surge of emotion at their words. For months, she had focused solely on proving to herself and her doctors that she could return to duty. She had endured countless physical therapy sessions, pushed through pain that sometimes left her gasping for breath, and fought against the doubt that crept in during her darkest moments. But she had never considered that her struggle might inspire others, or that her fellow soldiers would see her as anything other than damaged goods. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I'm not a hero. I'm just a soldier who refuses to let an enemy bomb decide how my story ends." Colonel Patterson finally found his voice, though it came out rougher than usual. "Captain, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your character and your commitment without understanding the facts. That was wrong of me, and it was poor leadership." The admission seemed to cost him considerable effort. Patterson had built his career on never showing weakness or admitting mistakes, believing that such displays undermined his authority. But standing before a soldier who had literally bled for her country and then fought her way back to serve again, his usual rules seemed inadequate. Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the struggle to maintain his commanding presence. "Sir, you couldn't have known. I've worked hard to hide these scars and the limitations they cause. Most people see what they expect to see, and in the military that's usually strength and capability." "That's no excuse," Patterson replied firmly. "A good commander learns about his soldiers before making judgments about their worth. I failed in that basic responsibility." The other soldiers continued to gather around, their morning exercises completely forgotten as they witnessed this unprecedented display of vulnerability and honesty from both their commanding officer and their new team member. Many of them had served under Patterson for months or years, and they had never seen him admit fault or show uncertainty. Corporal Williams, a communications specialist who had been with the unit for 2 years, spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what happens now? Does Captain Martinez still need to complete the assessment?" It was a practical question that highlighted the unusual nature of the situation. Military protocols existed for almost every scenario, but there was no standard procedure for when a fitness assessment became a revelation about combat injuries and personal courage. Patterson considered the question carefully, recognizing that his response would set the tone for Sarah's integration into the unit and possibly affect his relationship with all his soldiers. "The assessment continues, but with appropriate accommodations for Captain Martinez's service-connected limitations. We'll work with medical personnel to establish modified standards that challenge her appropriately while respecting her physical constraints." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had prepared herself for the possibility of being transferred to a desk job, or even forced into medical retirement if this confrontation went badly. The colonel's willingness to adapt his standards while maintaining her dignity as a soldier was more than she had dared to hope for. "Sir, I appreciate that, but I want to be clear about something," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't want special treatment or lower standards. I want to contribute to this unit at the highest level my abilities allow. If there are tasks I can't perform due to my injuries, I'll find other ways to add value. But I won't use my scars as an excuse to avoid challenges." Patterson nodded slowly, a new respect evident in his expression. "That's exactly what I would expect from any soldier in my unit, Captain. We'll establish realistic parameters that push you to excel within your capabilities." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Major Thompson, the unit's executive officer, who had been drawn by the unusual gathering on the training field. Thompson was known for his diplomatic skills and often served as a bridge between Patterson's harsh methods and the needs of the soldiers under their command. "Colonel, is everything all right here?" Thompson asked, his gaze taking in the assembled soldiers and the obvious tension in the air. Patterson straightened, his command presence returning as he addressed his executive officer. "Major, we've just had an important discussion about realistic assessment standards and the need to understand our soldiers' backgrounds before making judgments about their capabilities." Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly at this uncharacteristic statement from his commanding officer, but he simply nodded. "Of course, sir. Is there anything specific you need me to coordinate with medical or administrative personnel?" "Yes," Patterson replied. I want a complete review of Captain Martinez's medical records and consultation with her doctors about appropriate duty limitations and accommodations. Not to limit her service, but to ensure we're utilizing her skills effectively while respecting her service-connected injuries. As the two officers discussed administrative details, Sarah found herself surrounded by her fellow soldiers, many of whom wanted to express their respect for what she had shared. The atmosphere on the training field had completely transformed from one of judgment and testing to one of mutual respect and understanding. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation on the training field, and the atmosphere within Colonel Patterson's unit had undergone a remarkable transformation. Word of Captain Martinez's revelation had spread throughout the base, not as gossip, but as a story of courage that had touched every soldier who heard it. The ripple effects of that morning continued to influence how the unit operated and how its members viewed both strength and sacrifice. Sarah sat in the unit's briefing room, reviewing intelligence reports for an upcoming training exercise. Her integration into the team had progressed more smoothly than she had ever imagined possible. Colonel Patterson had been true to his word, working with medical personnel to establish modified physical standards that challenged her while respecting her limitations. More importantly, he had begun to examine his own leadership methods and their impact on his soldiers. The briefing room door opened, and Sergeant Rodriguez entered, carrying a cup of coffee and a folder of documents. Over the past weeks, he had become something of an unofficial mentor to Sarah, sharing insights about the unit's dynamics and helping her navigate the complex personalities within the group. "Morning, Captain," Rodriguez said, settling into a chair across from her. "How are you feeling about tomorrow's field exercise?" Sarah looked up from her reports, a slight smile crossing her face. "Nervous, but in a good way. It's been a long time since I've led a team in a combat simulation. I'm eager to see how well I can perform with all these modifications." The upcoming exercise was significant for several reasons. It would be Sarah's first opportunity to demonstrate her tactical leadership abilities to the unit, and it would also test the new assessment protocols that Patterson had implemented following their confrontation. The colonel had spent considerable time reviewing not just Sarah's case but the files of all his soldiers, looking for instances where his rigid standards might have overlooked individual circumstances or capabilities. "You'll do fine," Rodriguez assured her. "The team respects you now. What you shared that day changed how we all think about what it means to be strong. Private Johnson told me yesterday that you've inspired him to push through his own challenges instead of complaining about minor discomforts." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had always hoped that her return to active duty might inspire other wounded warriors to fight for their own recovery, but she hadn't expected her story to resonate with soldiers who had never faced serious injuries. Colonel Patterson appeared in the doorway, his bearing still commanding but noticeably less intimidating than it had been a month earlier. "Captain Martinez, Sergeant Rodriguez, good morning. I wanted to discuss the leadership structure for tomorrow's exercise." As Patterson entered and took a seat, Sarah noticed the change in his demeanor that had gradually developed since their encounter. He was still demanding and held high standards, but he had learned to temper his approach with genuine interest in understanding his soldiers' capabilities and limitations. "Sir," Sarah replied, "I've been reviewing the scenario parameters and the team compositions. I think we can adapt the standard tactics to accommodate the mixed experience levels in our squad." Patterson nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of adaptive thinking I want to see. Tell me about your approach." Sarah opened her folder and spread out the tactical maps on the table. The scenario calls for a reconnaissance mission with potential for enemy contact. Given Private Johnson's limited field experience and Corporal Williams's exceptional communication skills, I plan to position them where Williams can coordinate intelligence while Johnson observes and learns, without being exposed to the heaviest simulated combat. "And how do you plan to handle the physical demands of the mission?" Patterson asked, his question carrying genuine curiosity rather than the challenging tone he might have used before. "I've studied the terrain and identified routes that will allow me to maintain tactical effectiveness while managing my physical limitations," Sarah replied confidently. "There are 2 points where the standard approach would require rapid movement across uneven ground that could aggravate my back injuries. I've planned alternative routes that add approximately 15 minutes to the mission timeline, but reduce the risk of injury while maintaining our tactical advantage." Rodriguez leaned forward, impressed by the thoroughness of her planning. That's smart tactical thinking, Captain. Most officers would just push through and hope for the best. Patterson was quiet for a moment, studying the maps and Sarah's annotations. When he looked up, there was something approaching admiration in his expression. Captain, this is some of the most thoughtful mission planning I've seen in years. You've anticipated challenges, developed alternatives, and considered the capabilities of every team member. This is exactly the kind of adaptive leadership our military needs. The praise felt genuine and hard-earned, making it all the more meaningful to Sarah. She had spent months wondering if her injuries would forever limit her effectiveness as an officer. But Patterson's assessment suggested that her experiences had actually enhanced her leadership capabilities in unexpected ways. There's something else I want to discuss, Patterson continued, his tone becoming more serious. I've been reviewing my leadership methods over the past few weeks, and I've realized that my approach has been inadequate. I've been so focused on identifying weakness that I've failed to recognize different types of strength. This admission represented a significant evolution in Patterson's thinking. He had built his reputation on breaking down soldiers to build them back up stronger, but Sarah's example had shown him that some soldiers arrived already broken and rebuilt, requiring different handling to reach their full potential. Sir, every leader has room for growth, Sarah replied diplomatically. The important thing is being willing to adapt when you learn something new. Yes, but the cost of my stubbornness could have been losing a valuable officer, Patterson said bluntly. If you had accepted a transfer rather than showing me those scars, this unit would have lost someone with your tactical skills and combat experience. That failure would have been entirely on me. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Major Thompson entered, followed by Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the base's chief medical officer. Dr. Hayes had been working closely with Patterson to develop new assessment protocols that could identify and accommodate various types of service-connected limitations without compromising operational effectiveness. Colonel, I have the results of the medical review you requested, Dr. Hayes announced, settling into an empty chair and opening a thick folder. Captain Martinez's case has helped us identify several other soldiers in the unit who might benefit from modified assessment standards. This development represented the broader impact of Sarah's courage in revealing her injuries. Her willingness to show her scars had not only changed her own situation but had prompted a comprehensive review of how the military assessed and utilized soldiers with various limitations. How many cases are we talking about? Patterson asked, his expression showing both interest and concern. 7 soldiers total, Dr. Hayes replied. 3 with service-connected injuries, 2 with chronic conditions that don't impair their core job functions, and 2 with psychological service connections that affect certain types of performance but not their overall capability. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and responsibility as she realized that her moment of vulnerability had opened doors for other soldiers who had been struggling in silence. The military culture of stoic strength often made it difficult for soldiers to admit limitations or seek accommodations, even when such support could enhance their effectiveness rather than diminish it. The morning of the field exercise dawned clear and crisp, with a light breeze carrying the scent of pine trees across the training grounds. Sarah stood with her assigned squad, watching as Colonel Patterson addressed the assembled units before the simulation began. The transformation in his leadership style had become evident to everyone in the unit, and today would test whether his new approach could maintain operational effectiveness while supporting soldiers with various limitations. Today's exercise will test not just your individual capabilities, but your ability to function as adaptive teams, Patterson announced to the gathered soldiers. Real combat situations rarely conform to textbook scenarios, and the best units are those that can modify their tactics based on the actual strengths and limitations of their personnel. Sarah adjusted her equipment, feeling the familiar weight of her gear against her scarred torso. The past month had brought significant improvements in her physical conditioning, but she had learned to work within her constraints rather than fight against them. Her tactical vest was positioned carefully to avoid pressure points where shrapnel remained embedded, and her weapon was adjusted to accommodate the limited range of motion in her left shoulder. Private Johnson approached nervously, his young face showing a mixture of excitement and anxiety about his first major field exercise. Captain, I wanted to thank you for including me in your squad. I know I'm the least experienced soldier here, and I appreciate the chance to learn from you. Private, experience is something you gain by participating in exercises like this one, Sarah replied with an encouraging smile. Stay alert, follow your training, and don't be afraid to ask questions when we debrief. The goal today is learning, not perfection. Sergeant Rodriguez joined them, his expression serious but confident. Captain, the communications equipment is ready, and I've briefed Corporal Williams on the modified protocols you developed. The team understands their roles and the alternative routes you've planned. As the exercise began, Sarah's squad moved through the wooded terrain with careful precision. The scenario called for them to conduct reconnaissance on a simulated enemy position while avoiding patrol units and gathering specific intelligence. Sarah had studied the mission parameters extensively, identifying potential challenges and developing contingency plans that would allow her to lead effectively despite her physical limitations. The first test came an hour into the exercise when they encountered unexpected terrain that wasn't accurately represented on their maps. A steep ravine blocked their planned route, and the standard military approach would have been to rappel down one side and climb the other. For Sarah, this would have been extremely dangerous given the shrapnel near her spine and the limited strength in her left arm. Hold position, Sarah whispered into her radio, signaling her team to take cover while she assessed the situation. She quickly reviewed the alternative routes she had studied, cross-referencing them with their current position and the time constraints of the mission. Rodriguez, take Johnson and circle north to the bridge crossing point. Williams, you're with me on the southern route through the creek bed. We'll converge at checkpoint Alpha in 40 minutes, she commanded quietly. Private Johnson looked confused by the split formation, but Rodriguez nodded approvingly. The plan would add time to their mission, but would allow both elements to reach their objective safely while maintaining tactical effectiveness. It was exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that Patterson had emphasized in his new training protocols. As Sarah and Williams moved through the creek bed, she felt the familiar ache in her left side where the largest piece of shrapnel pressed against her ribs with each step. The cold water soaked through her boots, and the uneven rocky surface required careful foot placement to avoid aggravating her back injuries. But her tactical awareness remained sharp, and she continued to coordinate with the other element through hand signals and brief radio communications. 20 minutes into their movement, Williams spotted movement ahead that indicated the presence of opposing force personnel. Sarah immediately signaled for cover and began assessing their options. The enemy position was between them and their objective, and standard doctrine would call for either a direct assault or a lengthy detour that would compromise their mission timeline. Williams, can you establish communications with the other element without revealing our position? Sarah whispered. Yes, ma'am, using the directional antenna we brought specifically for this type of situation, Williams replied, already adjusting his equipment. Sarah's modified tactical approach had included bringing additional communications gear to compensate for the challenges posed by split formations and alternative routes. While it meant carrying extra weight, it provided flexibility that standard tactics couldn't match. Within minutes, Williams had established contact with Rodriguez and Johnson, who reported that they had successfully reached the checkpoint and were in position to provide a distraction that would allow Sarah's element to bypass the enemy position. Undetected, the coordination worked perfectly. As the opposing force responded to movement from Rodriguez's position, Sarah and Williams were able to slip past their flank and reach the objective area. Once there, they discovered additional intelligence that hadn't been part of the original scenario, evidence that the exercise controllers had added complexity to test their adaptability. Captain, this changes our extraction plan significantly, Williams observed, studying the new information. The enemy force is larger than we expected, and they have additional positions covering our planned exit routes. Sarah felt a familiar surge of tactical clarity as she processed the new situation. This was the kind of dynamic problem-solving that had always been her strength, and her injuries hadn't diminished that capability. If anything, her experience with adaptation and finding alternative solutions had enhanced her ability to think creatively under pressure. Contact Rodriguez and tell him to maintain his position but prepare for a modified extraction, she decided. We're going to gather this additional intelligence and then use the confusion from their response to slip out through Sector 7. The plan required precise timing and coordination, but Sarah's team executed it flawlessly. By the time the exercise controllers called an end to the simulation, her squad had not only completed their primary mission, but had gathered bonus intelligence that other units had missed entirely. As the teams gathered for the after-action review, Colonel Patterson's expression showed clear satisfaction with the day's results. The new assessment protocols had allowed several soldiers to demonstrate capabilities that might have been overlooked under the old system, and Sarah's squad had proven that adaptive tactics could be more effective than rigid adherence to standard procedures. "Captain Martinez," Patterson announced to the assembled group, "your squad's performance today exemplifies the kind of innovative thinking and adaptive leadership that makes units successful in real-world operations. The modifications you made to standard tactics didn't compromise effectiveness, they enhanced it." The praise felt different than the perfunctory acknowledgement Sarah had received earlier in her career. This recognition was based on a complete understanding of both her capabilities and limitations, making it more meaningful than any commendation she had received before her injuries. Sergeant Rodriguez approached her as the formal debrief concluded. "Captain, that was some of the best tactical leadership I've seen in 15 years of service. You turned what could have been limitations into advantages by thinking differently about how to accomplish the mission." Private Johnson nodded enthusiastically. "I learned more today than in my entire time in basic training. The way you adapted to unexpected situations and kept the team working together was incredible." As Sarah packed her gear and prepared to leave the training area, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning a month ago, when she had stood on the PT field facing Colonel Patterson's mockery. 6 months had passed since the morning that changed everything for Captain Sarah Martinez and Colonel Patterson's unit. The base buzzed with activity as preparations began for the annual command inspection, a comprehensive evaluation that would determine the unit's readiness rating and potentially influence future assignments and resources. For Sarah, this inspection represented the ultimate test of whether her integration into the unit had been truly successful. She stood in her office, reviewing personnel files and training records that she would present to the inspection team. As the unit's newly appointed training officer, a position she had earned through her innovative approaches to adaptive tactics, Sarah had spent the past months developing programs that maximized the potential of every soldier regardless of their individual limitations or circumstances. A knock on her door interrupted her concentration. "Come in," she called, looking up to see Colonel Patterson entering with a serious expression on his face. "Captain, I wanted to speak with you before the inspection team arrives tomorrow," Patterson said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "I've received some information that I think you should know about." Sarah felt a familiar tension in her stomach, the same feeling she had experienced before difficult briefings during her deployment. "What kind of information, sir?" "The inspection team includes General Morrison, who specifically requested to review our adaptive training protocols," Patterson explained. "It seems that word of our new assessment methods has reached higher levels of command, and there's considerable interest in whether our approach could be implemented across other units." This news was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Sarah's courage in revealing her scars had started a chain reaction that had improved not only her own situation, but had led to significant changes in how the unit operated. If the inspection went well, these changes could influence military policy on a much broader scale. "Sir, what exactly will they want to see?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing through the various programs and protocols they had developed. "Everything," Patterson replied with a slight smile. "They want to observe training exercises, review our modified assessment standards, interview soldiers who have benefited from the new protocols, and understand how we've maintained operational effectiveness while accommodating individual limitations." The scope of the inspection was daunting, but Sarah felt confident in what they had accomplished. The unit's performance metrics had actually improved since implementing the new protocols, as soldiers were now able to contribute more effectively when their capabilities were properly understood and utilized. "There's something else," Patterson continued, his expression becoming more serious. "General Morrison specifically asked to meet with you. He's read your file and wants to understand how your experience influenced the development of these programs." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the significance of this request. Her story had become the foundation for everything they had built, and she would need to articulate not just what had happened, but why it mattered for the broader military community. The next morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the organized chaos that always accompanied high-level inspections. Sarah watched from her office window as the inspection team's vehicles arrived, their occupants emerging with the confident bearing of senior officers accustomed to evaluating military units. General Morrison was exactly what Sarah had expected. A tall, distinguished officer with gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he entered her office accompanied by Colonel Patterson and his aide, Sarah felt the same nervous energy she had experienced before her first combat mission. "Captain Martinez," General Morrison said, extending his hand with a firm grip. "I've been looking forward to this conversation. Your story has traveled quite far through military circles, and I'm interested in understanding how personal experience can drive institutional change." "Thank you, sir. I'm honored to share what we've learned," Sarah replied, gesturing for the group to take seats around her conference table. General Morrison's first question was direct and challenging. "Captain, some officers believe that accommodating individual limitations weakens military readiness. How do you respond to that concern?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had her answer ready. "Sir, I believe that understanding and working with individual limitations actually enhances readiness by maximizing the contribution of every soldier. When we ignore or dismiss limitations, we lose valuable personnel and miss opportunities to develop innovative approaches to challenges." "Can you give me a specific example?" Morrison asked, leaning forward with obvious interest. "Certainly, sir. Sergeant First Class Thompson in our unit has hearing damage from an IED explosion that prevents him from serving in traditional infantry roles. Under the old system, he would have been transferred to a desk job or medically retired. Under our new protocols, we've utilized his exceptional visual observation skills and tactical knowledge to make him one of our most effective reconnaissance specialists." General Morrison made notes on a small pad as Sarah spoke, occasionally nodding or asking follow-up questions. His aide, a young major, was recording the conversation and seemed particularly interested in the practical applications of the adaptive protocols. "Tell me about the impact on unit cohesion," Morrison continued. "Some commanders worry that special accommodations create resentment among soldiers who don't receive them." Colonel Patterson spoke up at this point. "Sir, we've actually seen the opposite effect. When soldiers understand that accommodations are based on legitimate medical needs rather than favoritism, and when they see that the goal is maximizing everyone's contribution rather than lowering standards, unit cohesion improves." Sarah nodded in agreement. "The key has been transparency and education. When soldiers understand why certain modifications are made and how they serve the unit's overall effectiveness, they tend to be supportive rather than resentful." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering everything from training methodologies to performance metrics. General Morrison's questions were thorough and sometimes challenging, but Sarah could sense his growing interest in what they had accomplished. Finally, Morrison sat back in his chair and looked directly at Sarah. "Captain, I want you to know that your courage in revealing your injuries and fighting for your place in this unit has had implications far beyond what you probably imagined. We're currently dealing with a significant number of wounded warriors who want to continue serving, but are being underutilized because commanders don't know how to accommodate their limitations effectively." Sarah felt a surge of emotion at his words. She had hoped that her story might help other wounded soldiers, but she hadn't fully grasped the scope of the problem or the potential impact of the solutions they had developed. "Sir, if there's anything we can do to help expand these programs, I'm completely committed to that effort," Sarah said earnestly. Morrison smiled for the first time during their meeting. "I was hoping you would say that, Captain. I'm recommending that you be assigned to a joint task force that will develop service-wide protocols based on what you've accomplished here. Your experience, both as a wounded warrior and as the officer who helped develop these adaptive training methods, makes you uniquely qualified for this role." The offer was both exciting and overwhelming. It would mean leaving the unit that had become her home and taking on responsibilities that could affect thousands of soldiers across all branches of the military. But it also represented the opportunity to ensure that no other wounded warrior would face the kind of mockery and dismissal she had encountered. "Sir, I would be honored to accept that assignment," Sarah replied without hesitation. As the inspection team prepared to leave, General Morrison shook her hand once more. "Captain, what you did that morning on the training field, showing your scars and refusing to accept dismissal, that took more courage than most soldiers will ever need to display. The fact that you turned that moment into systematic change that will help others shows the kind of leadership our military needs." Later that afternoon, as Sarah sat in her office processing the day's events, Colonel Patterson stopped by with coffee and a reflective expression. "You know, Captain, 6 months ago I thought I was a pretty good judge of soldiers and their capabilities," he said, settling into his usual chair. "What you taught me is that sometimes the strongest people are those who have been broken and rebuilt themselves. Your scars weren't evidence of weakness. They were proof of strength I was too ignorant to recognize." Sarah smiled, thinking about how much both of them had changed since that confrontational morning. "Sir, I think we both learned that strength comes in many forms, and the best leaders are those who can recognize and nurture all of them." As the sun set over the base, casting long shadows across the training fields where her journey had begun, Sarah reflected on the unexpected path that had led her to this moment. The scars that had once made her feel damaged and limited had become the foundation for changes that would help countless other soldiers. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest victories came not from hiding our wounds, but from having the courage to reveal them and transform them into sources of strength for others.